My name is Catherine Healy, and I'm National Coordinator for the New Zealand Sex Workers Collective. We started our organisation in 1987 as much younger sex workers, and we wanted to change lots of the conditions that were impacting on our life, including the fear of HIV and being arrested by the police. We wanted labour rights, and we also wanted to achieve decriminalisation. Today in New Zealand, I can say that for the most part we have achieved decriminalisation of prostitution. So we are in the position of being able to talk about that experience.
Thank you so much. Can you maybe shortly explain what decriminalization means?
Yes, decriminalisation to us in our country means that we're treated in the same way by law as anyone else in the workforce. So we can go about our work in a way that other people do. We're allowed to join unions, we're allowed to have occupational safety and health guidelines. We're allowed to go and report exploitation, to the police or the labour inspectorate. So we're allowed to go about our work in the same manner as anyone else. It means that we aren't registered. We're not treated differently in that respect.
Can you go a little bit deeper what it exactly means, or also from your experience comparing to the situation before the decriminalization, how exactly the work for you as a sex worker is?
When it was criminalised, we had to pretend we were doing other things like massage. So most of us worked either in massage parlours and pretended that was the nature of our work. And of course, we were all sex workers, and of course, we were working in brothels. Now, because it's decriminalised, that part of sex work can be recognised. Also, some of us did work and meet our clients on the street, and we could be arrested if we were asking for money for sex. That was a crime, so it was considered to be soliciting. That's been decriminalised. So those laws, brothel keeping and soliciting, have been taken off our law books. They don't exist, and so that allows us to get on with our work. And also we can share information with each other quite easily. Before we had to pretend and hide anything related to sex work when it was criminal. And now, if we go to a brothel, the brothel will say, hi, we'd like to hire you. This is what you need to know as a sex worker. So nothing is behind closed doors in that regard. People can talk quite freely. We can also work with our friends and colleagues. We can work from home. We can meet our clients in bars. We can meet them just as we like in so many different ways. None of it's illegal.
Sounds very, very interesting. So, maybe also for our Swiss audience, how is the legal framework behind?
Yes, we do. We certainly have a legal framework. So it means, for our brothels, for example, an operator of a brothel has to get an operator's certificate. But for a sex worker, the sex worker can just be hired, and mostly they're considered to be independent contractors. So you are hired by a principal contractor and you work in that place, and sometimes you have contracts with them and they may say, we don't want you to work anywhere else, we just want you to work for us, and you might agree to that term, or you might say, look, that doesn't work for me. I prefer to work here, and I prefer to work across the street or in another city, and can we change the terms of that contract? Sounds ideal, and it's not always like this in practice. Of course, you know, there are arguments and there are, you know, power dynamics, but in the main, sex workers have a lot of choice in the different ways that they can work. The police have to get a warrant. They can't come into our premises without being invited. So when I was a sex worker, the police were never invited, of course, and they would come in and pretend to be our clients and arrest us and take us to court and fine us, and our names would be published in the newspapers, and, you know, it was terrifying.
Yes, but now it's not, so they are not allowed anymore to just come in.
No. No, they have to be, you know, they have to treat, you know, sex workers like any other group. And of course, if they are concerned, for example, if they think there's someone under the age of 18 working in a brothel, then they can uplift a warrant from the court, or go and go in and look at that particular situation.
Can you explain how you managed to change that law?
That's right. We had these concerns, and we had to speak out quite clearly in the media. We had to build our relationships with government agencies and influence the policy advisors who were writing reports, for example. We also had to build a lot of support in the community with allies. So we reached out to a lot of different kinds of organisations, public health, women's organisations, human rights organisations, to you know, get this change. So that, you know, that is really quite a long process for us. It took quite some time.
For me, the big question is how was it possible that sex workers organize themselves? Because, as you already mentioned before, the situation was like illegal, and you feel like not that powerful to speak loud because you're still making like illegal things. And so how was this possible?
So it was also the times, I think, you know, like there was a lot of concern in public health about HIV and the role that sex workers would play inadvertently. We had a sense that we were going to be okay in the main, protecting ourselves with safer sex and all of that, but we didn't really know for sure, and the government reached out to us and said, would we like to manage our own educative program for HIV? And we didn't want the government to put words into our mouth. We wanted to be able to say all those things and talk in our way, that, you know, our particular way of talking to each other as sex workers. We didn't want to sound like we were government officials. So we signed a contract with government and we designed our own program, and they said, yes, that's good. But we also have our autonomy and independence, so that's important too, that you don't lose your beating heart. And in our case, our beating heart is to fight for the rights of sex workers and not just do as we're told, you know. Speak up when there's a problem and an issue.
Very impressed, actually.
What did you learn through this process, or like what advice could you give sex workers in Switzerland that are trying to organize? Do you have?
Oh, I'm sure it would be the other way around. People in Switzerland could give us advice, I'm sure. For us, we thought it was so obvious, that the law needed to change. There was a massive injustice. But when we talked to the politicians, we had to feel it through as if we were in their shoes. So they had different concerns to us, and we had to convince them that our concern was the thing they needed to worry about, not whether they got re-elected or lots of angry emails because you are taking the side of sex workers. So you have to listen and feel it through, I think.
It's a long process, as you already mentioned it.
Yeah, I think we took longer. We were quite polite, and we waited. And then we got angry, and we thought, no, this is just not good enough. This has got to happen. And we said to government, you can take the money back. We're going underground if you don't do something. To have, to look realistically at the policies and the laws that are harming us, and that was a realistic request.
I think it would be interesting now have a broader view on the society. How can you say that something changed over the last 20 years?
Yes, I think it's fascinating. Stigma, of course, is everywhere, and people still have concerns about whether sex workers are safe. And, with that comes this kind of stigma. They can't quite believe that people would say, look, I'm happy, I'm okay, I'm a sex worker, so what? That's not my whole being, I do other things. So there is that. I think the discussion has certainly got richer and better since decriminalisation. People have more respect, recognise that sex workers are people, a part of neighbourhoods. And I mean, I know when I look at sex workers, and they will say things that I could only fantasise about when I was a young sex worker. When it was criminalised, they'll say, look, I can just ring the police and ask them, I'll go down and see them. And we were like, and so that, that kind of massive change is really important. Sex workers know that they have rights, and know that they're entitled to have a solution if something goes wrong.
So you think with the changed law, the self-empowerment of sex workers grew up, kind of? Yes,
I do. I think, it's fantastic. There's a lot of organising, sharing of information, lots of online support groups. And I don't think that's just here. It's certainly a global reality for a lot of sex workers. But the difference, I think, here is that it's unlikely that sex workers will be kicked off sites because they're sex workers. So, they can be on these sites, not if they're coming out of other countries where sex work is still criminalised, but if they're homegrown, they know that they're allowed to do certain things.
It's like the discourse over sex work, did that change also, or is it still very related to human trafficking, which is the case in Switzerland, in Europe?
Yeah. Well, the discourse around human trafficking was very strong. When the law was changing, there was a piece put into the legislation on behalf of sex workers who would be trafficked. And it was the Minister of Immigration said, look, the way to stop trafficking of sex workers is to make sure that no sex worker can come to New Zealand. And we were absolutely shocked. We were like, no, you need to give sex workers rights. You know, they should be rightfully able to travel and all of that. So we're still fighting that kind of situation. But I think, you know, the discourse in many respects has become more sophisticated. We still have people who will say the nature of sex work is about violence, and, you know, the radical feminist perspective and other fundamentalist perspectives will echo that. But, you know, even with the anti-trafficking human, you know, the anti-trafficking lobby groups, a lot of them are supporting our call to have the migrant situation addressed and decriminalised. So we're pleased. I mean, I think they've moved in their thinking. The evidence is compelling, the evidence is compelling that sex workers are much better off when sex work related activities are decriminalised. It's ridiculous to keep sex workers in tight legal frameworks that ultimately lead to their criminalisation.
Can you just say some words to what's then the situation like for migrant sex workers in New Zealand?
Yes, we do have migrant sex workers, and they come here on tourist visas or student visas or work visas. We've even had migrant sex workers from Switzerland. And you can come from Switzerland to work in New Zealand if you're under a certain age for 2 years, and you can do anything except sex work. Wow. And that problem, of course, means that some people are discovered breaking the immigration and sex work legislation law around migrant sex workers, and so they're deported. And it does also mean that they can be exploited. It's got some way to go. We would like to repeal that legislation, but the politicians are quite nervous, and it's tricky.
We have some very specific questions from sex workers from Switzerland, just wondering how everyday life is as sex worker in New Zealand. Maybe start, you already mentioned a little bit how the relationship between sex worker and the police is in New Zealand at the moment.
Well, sex workers don't have much to do with the police. Like every citizen, they can contact the police and report crimes committed against them. The relationship is dramatically different when it's decriminalised.
There is another question. There is a condom requirement, and how is this introduced and how is it enforced?
Yeah, so it hasn't been enforced against sex workers, but it has been enforced against clients. And in fact, just recently, a case was taken to court, and the judge said, look, okay, he didn't use a condom, but I consider that sexual assault. And the sex worker felt that as well, that it was sexual assault, because the agreement with the client was that the client would wear a condom, and the client took the condom off, and the sex worker was like, well, you know, I feel like I've been assaulted, I didn't agree to that. So the penalty was actually not for removing the condom, but rather for a more serious crime of sexual assault. And it benefits everyone. Like, it was a sex worker case that went to court, but it benefits everyone in that situation. Now that the precedent's been set in court.
I mean, yes, that's a benefit for the whole society.
That's right.
That's
and the same also with the sexual harassment case. That was also you know, the biggest settlement was a sex worker case. So it's set a precedent, and, you know, benefits everyone. And I think sex workers are very strong around consent and all the discussion, and have a lot to teach in that regard also, with a flow over effect into the wider community.
Thank you so much for sharing. Actually, I'm so impressed.
I was just wondering how stigma still is.
Yes.
You experience stigma in New Zealand.
Yes.
But I guess it's similar to here.
It's possibly it's fascinating stigma, and because you think about how many people speak out as sex workers, and we have a lot of sex workers who are feeling more comfortable about saying things and speaking, which is fantastic. But it shouldn't always be on the sex worker to destigmatize, because a lot of people say, oh, you know, if you want to destigmatize sex work, you need to come out and start speaking out, like, you know, the GBLTIQ community has. But I think it's also, you know, this is where allies can support sex workers. And, you know, if you're looking at the kinds of things that people say, they still say things about sex workers. They say, oh, you know, oh gosh, you know, he's a terrible business person. He's such a prostitute. And that casual kind of stigmatization, it was ironic. It's just so ironic, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy to change how society is thinking, so it's a long process. But as you, I mean, as you already said, it's a way to go to decriminalize sex work, also for a long process of destigmatization.
Yeah, yes, there is a long way to go, I think. And, you know, we have great things happening, of course, everywhere in the world. You know, it's great to hear about Belgium and, you know, the progress that's being made in different parts of Australia and in the States and so on, in South Africa, and lots of countries that are looking at decriminalisation. It's really good. But it's such a fight.
Are you in contact with other countries, like other organizations that are combating as well? Yes.
No, it's really wonderful. You know, like there are sex worker organizations and allies all over the globe fighting and supporting for change in this respect, and I think it's good.
Like, we get often asked about the Nordic model as a good solution for sex workers. What do you answer?
I would jump out of my seat and say it's a terrible, terrible model. And it's awful. You know, the impact it has on sex workers. You are forced to isolate, to work on your own. I just cannot believe that people would swallow that model and think it's safer for sex workers.
Yeah.
Why do you think there is such a will of many society to regulate sex work?
I think it probably starts somewhere with thinking of sex workers as being cisgendered women who need to be protected in a paternalistic way, and you know, it starts from that place of you know, they know not what they do, and if they do, they're very naughty and very bad. But if they are innocent victims, then, you know, like people who've been trafficked, etc., will help them and will go all out. But if they're self-determined, naughty sex workers, then we'll punish them. You know, it's that naughty woman, naughty, it just can't be controlled.
So maybe just like an ending question,
Yes.
or like two. So what do you wish for the situation of sex workers in New Zealand and for the situation of sex workers in the whole world?
Thank you. We would like to make sure that we can go deeper into decriminalisation and achieve it for every sex worker who's working not only in our country. We'd like to see decriminalisation on a deep level, not just the laws, but the minds and the attitudes towards sex workers change globally.